Okay, we're taking up the doctrine of man, what in the various heads of theology is called anthropology. I know that word's used in totally different fields also, but it's used in theology. Anthropology, the study of man or the doctrine uh, of man. First, and of course, the most important thing I think of all is that man is a creature and created by the Creator independently. It didn't evolve from some previous hominid life form or something like that, but it was specially created by God. Even in our denomination, while they allow a certain range of views about creation itself, um, they do restrict that you have to believe that man was separately, independently created directly by God, as the Bible teaches. I think teaches very clearly. That brings up uh, one obvious thing. I think, at least I hope it's obvious. Doesn't always seem obvious today, but I hope it is. And then one less obvious and somewhat problematic thing. What I'm talking about is this. First of all, being created by God, and we're told in the image of God, what in theology is often still referred to in Latin, the imago Dei, um, just image of God. It's one of those phrases. When I used to teach theology at Trinity, I tell the students that anytime you run into a Latin phrase in theology, it's usually traceable back to Augustine, and pretty much all of them are so much started with Augustine. So the imago Dei, or the image of God, uh, gives man a certain dignity, and worth sets him apart from other animals for that specially conferred dignity given by God. We talk about that as human dignity. The right to life is based on that. All of those sorts of things. But here's where it gets kind of complicated. It's when you try to define that image of God. Certainly, it's not that we look like God. Right? God is pure spirit, and so it's not the image of God. In that you look at, say, a boy and say, "Why, he's just the image of his father." I mean, he looks just like his father. Well, obviously, we don't physically resemble God, so that's not it. So, what is it? Well, that's where um, it gets difficult. That's why I like to stay on the side of this conferred dignity of all human beings, rather than dwelling much on the concept of the image of God, because um, I've seen too many definitions that become too narrow and can actually attack the true and necessary doctrine of the dignity of all people, of all human beings. Um, the classic way of representing the image of God, say we were created to image God in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. Um, but those, we don't know as God knows, but we know things. Um, we're not holy as God is holy, but we can understand holiness or righteousness and can pursue it. But the problem with that, if you stand too narrowly on righteousness, for example, then in the fall, when we became altogether unrighteous, unworthy in God's sight, under the wrath of God and so on, does that mean we lost the image of God? Well, no, it's clear that the image of God continued after the fall, um, particularly with God's statements to Noah, about not shedding man's blood because he's created in the image of God. So post-fall, after the fall, we are still in the image of God. So it can't be really righteousness as such. Um, some would say, well, it has to do with our will and decision making and so on. But so then, if someone is unconscious, are they no longer in the image of God? If someone is in a a coma or some other kind of state? Are they not in the image of God? Is their dignity no longer valid? Are they not worth protecting, and so on? That's where you begin to get the more narrowly you define that image of God, the more they're human beings, people who fall outside of it for one reason or another, and we mustn't do that. So you could say, well, it consists of all these sorts of things. Sometimes dominion, we're meant to have charge over creation, and again, that has its own particular difficulties and so on. Certainly, we were put in that position under God, but if it's not being exercised or being exercised wrongly, if we lost the image of God and so on. So anyway, that's why I find it somewhat problematic. It's an important concept. Man is created in the image of God and therefore has conferred worth, value, dignity given by God, and we must respect that and protect that. But then the definitions of image of God, which have to, in my opinion anyway, we have to sit a little bit loose on and understand that we don't fully understand what that is. Male and female created, so we're both image bearers, men and women are both image bearers of God, but as are children, I believe, children even in the womb, so are people who are no longer capable of thinking for whatever reason. They're still in the image of God, and their dignity is important and needs to be protected. Now, as we're created, another important aspect of this creation is that we, as Reformed folk particularly, insist that the Bible teaches that we consist of body and soul, or body and spirit, and that we believe the Bible uses those words interchangeably, that they're not separate things, but that we are two-part, dichotomous, it's called, a dichotomy. It's why is that important? Because what happens with people who are trichotomists, who say man consists of body, soul, and spirit, it just leads to all sorts of mischief, if you will. I remember one time talking to a very serious Christian man who was committed to this trichotomy and that particular view, but he wanted to open up the whole realm of psychology and psychiatry and so on, and not that those kind of folks are not useful in their place, but I think their place is well, anyway, never mind. But what he was doing was this. He said, just as you'd go to a physician if you have a problem with your body, and you can go to your pastor if you have a problem with your soul or spirit, but if you have trouble with your soul, you could go to the psychologist or whatever. So it's different treatments for the three different aspects of man, and that kind of thing happens. I think it's misled and often misleading. That we are body and soul, and meant to be in body and soul. Puts a great value on the body, and really should attack the notion that many have, which is more Platonic than Christian, the idea that the body is the prison house of the soul, and we're sort of waiting, longing for that day when the soul is set free. And a lot of Christians have kind of bought into that, some deliberately, some inadvertently. We talk so much about dying and going to be with Jesus, and dying and going to be in heaven, and so on, and that will be glorious. Paul tells us it's so much better to do that, and so that's good and proper. But what often happens, and perhaps we'll get to personal eschatology, what happens to the person at the end, and that is this: that for many Christians, almost most Christians these days, that's it. You die, your body goes into the grave, or is cremated or whatever, and your soul goes into heaven, and that's the end of the story. But it's not the end of the story. The Bible talks about the new heavens and the new earths and the general resurrection. We'll all be resurrected and again have bodies. And that's where we're meant to be, body and soul. And so at the great resurrection, general resurrection, we'll be united with our body, and that's the ultimate. That's the end product, if you will. It's not just to die and my spirit goes to heaven, soul, spirit, to be with Jesus, but when I'm back embodied with a new body and a better one, one that doesn't no longer, has all the problems of aging and sickness and disease and all of that, and my spirit renewed without the taint of sin and so on. Which brings me to the next important point, which is this. Man was created upright, but yet apparently able to sin. Able not to sin, able to sin. Again, language going back to Augustine. It was passa peccara, able to sin, and passa non peccara, able not to sin. But Adam chose sin and rebelled against God. And that great sin, because he was the federal head, we've already talked about that covenant theology, cast all of his descendants into sin and judgment. We're born with original sin. We're born with that. And original sin is not a very clever sin. Well, I never saw that before. But that first sin that taints all of mankind, everyone born in Adam is born with that original sin, and so already under the curse. And what that does is our spirits are damaged, our bodies are flawed. It opened the door to all sorts of infirmities and weaknesses, but also took us this place of what we call total depravity. And I think the best definition I've ever found of that total depravity is it's not total as to extent. It's not that we can't get worse. The restraining grace of God keeps people from being as bad as they could possibly be, at least most people. So the providential care of God, so we're not as bad as we could be. Dr. Gershon used to say there's always room for deprovement, and that we can get worse. But back to the definition, it means that sin affects every part. And Addison Leach, very fine teacher, was married to Elizabeth Elliot after her first husband was killed by the Auca Indians, a missionary. Then she married Addison Leach, who eventually died of cancer. But Ad Leach said once that if sin were blue, I would be some shade of blue all over. You see, so if sin were blue, it's not that I'd look like a Smurf, and just be that brilliant blue everywhere. But every part is affected, but every part is affected differently. And that's why some people sin in different ways and to different extents, but every part is fallen. Our thinking is fallen, our choosing is fallen, our desires are fallen, or physically we're fallen. So sin affects everything. And the other important aspect of total depravity is that we're no longer able not to sin. We're only passa peccara, able to sin. And you say, yeah, but people do lots of wonderful things. And sure they do. And thank God they do. And it's wonderful that they do. But because they're not really seriously done to the glory of God, they're not done in the spirit of God, they're, I believe what Jonathan Edwards called them shining sins. They're good things. Dr. Gershner used to talk about bad good works. They're good works, but they're not done to the glory of God. And so they're bad good works. Or we could say just flawed good works, the best things that people do. We can honor them, we can praise them, we can admire them, but God doesn't. He doesn't look at them in the way that we look at them. That's why Thomas Boston, Puritan writer, Scotsman, following pattern set by Augustine talked about the fourfold state of man. There's pre-fall, where man is in his integrity, created upright, but sought out his own devices. And then there's man post-fall, and fallen man is a fallen creature, not able to not sin. We're dead in sin, lost in sin, however you want to define that. But our very best things are not good in God's sight. They don't measure up to what God desires as a good work. Good things done for the right reasons, to the glory of God, according to the will of God, in the Spirit of God, that sort of thing. Then, of course, there's redemption, where we're forgiven in Christ, clothed with his righteousness, and now once again able not to sin. Right? We can do good works. We don't all the time, of course. We're still tainted by sin. We carry that old man still with us, even as we struggle to promote the new man within. But redeemed, we a different class of pre-fall, fallen, redeemed. So as Christians, and then ultimately the state of glorification, where we're no longer able to sin, because the desires are taken away. The sin, all of our sin nature is erased. We no longer see the attraction of sin, but we see the glory of God and want to, in all things, please Him. It's hard for us fallen creatures even to imagine a time where we won't be jealous, where we won't be petty. It's one of the things when you talk about heaven and different rewards of all rewards of grace, as again Augustine said. But if someone gets more rewards than you do, hard to imagine it. I'll be a little jealous of that. What did he do that I didn't? What's going on here? Or certainly I did more good things than he did. But that those sinful, competitive, jealous feelings will be taken away. So, man pre-fall in a state of integrity or original righteousness, and post-fall with no righteousness. Man redeemed, people, man generically, and redeemed with an imputed righteousness, the righteousness of Christ, but able now to resist sin, able to fight sin, able to do good in God's sight, and then man glorified, free from sin, and clothed still in the righteousness of Christ. So the Christian, I think that's a pretty fair summary of what we need to know about man, the creation, the dignity, the fourfold state of man, the ultimate destiny of man. All of those things are very important, and we need to understand them so that we understand ourselves rightly, and see our desperate need of a Savior in the doctrine of total depravity. And you can see where the Christian view is really butting up against some of the secular worldviews, evolution, that we came from nothing, and so there's no purpose, there's really no dignity, there's no destiny, those sorts of things. Secular humanism, we're all good, we just need to find how education or welfare, redistribution, or whatever is going to bring out that natural goodness that we all have, and of course we don't have that, and so you can think through that for yourself. But there's so many conflicting worldviews these days, but all of which the Christian worldview is in direct conflict with. But if we look at the Bible and say if the Bible is true, which we believe it is, then we must believe the Christian world and life view, and seek to understand and live out the implications of it. And like the hymns of Christ for the world, we sing, the world to Christ we bring. That's our purpose. And the next study, Lord willing, is going to be Christology, the doctrine of Christ.